The winter of 1878 did not arrive gently in Dakota Territory. It came the way all honest things come, without warning, without apology, and without mercy. One morning in late October, the sky turned the color of old pewter and stayed that way for 3 months. The temperature dropped below zero and seemed to forget how to climb back. The wind came off the open prairie with nothing to slow it down for 500 miles in any direction, and when it hit the walls of a cabin, you could feel the whole structure shudder like a living thing trying to hold itself together. Nell Voss was 64 years old that winter. She had the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her life, thick-knuckled, scarred across the palms rough as bark at the fingertips. She had crossed the Atlantic at 22, with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a husband named Heinrich, who believed that America would be good to people, willing to work hard enough. For 40 years, that belief had been mostly right. The textile mills of Pennsylvania had been brutal, but honest. The money had come slowly and it had stayed. And when they were old enough that most people would have stopped dreaming, Heinrich had spread a land map across the kitchen table one evening and pointed to Dakota Territory and said the word that had lived in both of them for decades: home. They had filed the homestead claim in 1875. Nell was 61. Heinrich was 67. Their neighbors in Pennsylvania had looked at them the way people look at the very old when they do something only the very young are supposed to do, with a mixture of admiration and quiet alarm. But Nell and Heinrich had loaded 2 wagons with tools and seed and the particular stubbornness of people who had waited their whole lives for something and were not going to stop short of it now. The first winter, 1876, they had survived in a house built from blocks of prairie sod stacked like dark bricks, the roof made from cottonwood poles covered with more sod and prairie grass. It was primitive and cold, and the mice lived in the walls, and the roof sagged under snow and leaked in every rain. But they had survived it. They had survived the second winter, too, in a proper milled lumber cabin that Heinrich had spent the summer building with the help of 2 neighbors. The cabin was better than the soddy. It had real walls and a plank floor and a stone fireplace that drew well enough to keep the main room above freezing most nights. Most nights. The winter of 1877 was when Nell first understood what Dakota cold truly meant. Not the academic understanding of a number on a thermometer. The bone-deep, lung-burning, sight-narrowing understanding that comes only from living inside it. She understood it when she went to wash her face in the basin one morning and found the water frozen solid in the basin sitting 6 inches from the fireplace. She understood it when the frost on the inside walls grew to 3/4 of an inch thick, and Heinrich scraped it off each morning with a flat iron, and the scraping became the sound she associated most with that season. She understood it when her breath crystallized in the air, before it left her lips hanging in small white clouds that drifted and dissolved, and she thought, we are breathing winter itself. Heinrich got sick in February of 1878. It started as a cough. Not a dramatic cough, a quiet one, the kind that begins in the back of the throat and works its way deeper over the course of days. Nell made tea with dried herbs she had brought from Pennsylvania and rubbed his chest with rendered fat and piled every blanket they owned on top of him and kept the fire burning day and night, burning through wood faster than she could haul it in. None of it was enough. The cold had gotten into him. That was how she thought about it. Not as a medical matter, not as pneumonia or pleurisy, or any of the words the doctor in Yankton would later use. It was simpler than that and more terrible. The cold had found a way through the walls and through the blankets and through Heinrich himself, and once it was in, it would not come out. He died on a Tuesday morning in late February. The sky outside was the same flat pewter gray it had been for 4 months. The temperature was 31 below zero. Nell sat beside him for a long time without moving, her hands folded in her lap, and when she finally stood up, she did not cry. She was not built for crying. She was built for the thing that comes after crying, the cold, clear, purposeful anger of a person who has decided that something must change. She buried him in the spring when the ground finally thawed enough to dig. She did not leave. That is the first thing anyone needs to understand about Nell Voss. The thought of leaving never appeared in her mind. She had 2 reasons to stay, and they were asleep in the back bedroom under a pile of quilts. Dottie was 8 years old that winter. She was the daughter of Heinrich's nephew, who had died in a cholera outbreak in 1877, along with his wife. Nell had taken the children in without deliberation, The way she did most things, she saw what needed to be done and she did it. Caleb was 6, a quiet boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. Dottie was something else entirely sharp and quick-minded and curious about everything, the kind of child who asked questions that adults found difficult to answer without feeling slightly embarrassed by their own ignorance. But Dottie had been coughing since November. It had started the same way Heinrich's had started, the quiet cough from the back of the throat. Nell had told herself it was different. Children cough. Children get colds and shake them off. Dottie was young and strong, and it was not the same thing. She had told herself this every day through December and January, feeding the story to herself in small, careful doses, the way you feed medicine to a child who does not want to take it. Then came the morning in late January when Nell went to wake Dottie and found blood on the pillow. Not much, a small dark spot maybe the size of a $50 coin, already dried and brown at the edges. But Nell stood in the doorway of that back bedroom for a long time looking at it, and the story she had been telling herself dissolved completely. She was looking at Heinrich's pillow. Different case, different child, same blood, same cold, same walls that could not keep the winter out. She walked to the fireplace. She put 2 more logs on the fire. She put the kettle on, and she stood at the window looking out at the flat white expanse of the Dakota prairie, and she thought with a clarity that comes to people who have made a decision they cannot unmake. Something has to change. Not a small thing, not a better chimney or thicker curtains or another layer of sod on the roof. Something fundamental, something that this cold cannot get through. She had money. That is the thing no one in the settlement knew or would have guessed from looking at her. 40 years of mill wages carefully kept. Heinrich had been frugal, the way immigrants who have known real poverty are frugal not from fear but from principle, from the understanding that money saved is options preserved. They had arrived in Dakota with more than most homesteaders, and Nell had spent carefully since Heinrich's death. She could have bought lumber. Good seasoned lumber enough to build a proper double-walled cabin with tight chinking and a heavy roof. She had thought about it. She had thought about it for all of February, turning the option over and examining it from every angle the way she examined a flawed piece of fabric, looking for the place where it would fail. And the place where it would fail was always the same. It was a cabin, wood, 4 walls of flat or pitched roof, the same essential design that Heinrich had built and that had let the cold in through every gap and crack and poorly seasoned board until the cold had found Heinrich himself and taken him. A better version of a failed design was still a failed design. You could make it tighter, make it heavier, make it from better materials, and it would still be at its core the same arrangement of wood and air and human intention facing down Dakota winter. And Dakota winter in Nell's experience was not impressed by intention. She thought about it while she cooked and cleaned and hauled firewood and sat up late mending the children's clothes by firelight. She thought about it the way she had always thought about difficult problems, not head-on, not by attacking them directly, but by circling around them slowly, letting them sit in the back of her mind while her hands were busy with other things, waiting for the moment when the answer would present itself with the quiet certainty of something that had been true all along. She had spent 30 years in textile mills understanding how materials work, how wool repels water because of the structure of the fiber, not because of any treatment applied to it. How multiple layers of fabric separated by air stop cold better than a single thick layer, because the air itself is the insulator and the fabric is just the container that holds the air in place. How the way a garment is shaped determines whether it protects the body beneath it. A flat sheet of the same wool that makes a good cloak is nearly useless if you try to use it as one. She thought about capes. Specifically, she thought about the heavy wool capes she had spent years making in the Pennsylvania mills, the ones designed for wet weather with their layered construction at the shoulders where the rain hit hardest, the way each layer of fabric overlapped the one below it, directing water down and away from the body beneath, not fighting the rain, not trying to stop it with sheer thickness. Working with gravity, using shape and overlap to make the water go somewhere, it was wanted rather than somewhere it was not. What if a building could work the same way? The answer came to her in Omaha. She had gone in early March to buy seed and supplies for the spring planting, a journey she had made twice before with Heinrich, and was making now for the first time alone. She drove the wagon herself 40 miles of frozen road, stopping overnight at a farmstead where a family named Hartwick took in travelers in exchange for whatever they could spare. It was the kind of country where people helped each other because the alternative was not surviving. Omaha in March was loud and muddy and alive in a way that Dakota in March was not. The river trade was resuming after the freeze. Wagons and carts crowded the main streets. The smell of the stockyards carried on the wind from the south. Nell moved through it with the efficiency of a woman who had a list and intended to complete it. She was cutting through a side street near the waterfront when she saw the yard. It had been a shipbuilding operation, once a mid-sized outfit that had been building steamboat hulls for the Missouri River trade. The sign above the gate was faded and one hinge had given way, so it hung at an angle. A hand-lettered notice was nailed to the fence post: assets for sale. Liquidation. Nell would not have stopped, except that she had always been curious about how things were made. It was a quality that had served her well in the textile mills, where understanding the machinery meant you could predict its failures and protect yourself from them. She stopped at the fence and looked through the gaps at what was stacked in the yard. The curved iron plates were stacked near the back wall, perhaps 14 of them, each one roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, bent in a gentle arc that had been designed to become the hull of a ship. They were heavy-gauge iron, dark with rust, in places still showing traces of black paint in others. They had been cut apart from a half-finished hull. The yard had gone bankrupt after a fire, and what remained was being sold for scrap. Most buyers, she would learn later, purchased the pieces to melt down for farm implements or equipment repairs. The iron was good metal. It would serve perfectly well in some other shape. Nell looked at those curved plates for a long time. She was not thinking about ships. She was thinking about the way a heavy wool cape sheds rain, the way the fabric overlaps at the shoulders, so that water has nowhere to go but down and away, never penetrating, never reaching the body beneath. She had made dozens of such capes in the Pennsylvania mills. She knew the principle so deeply it lived in her hands rather than her mind. What if iron could do the same thing, not as a wall, not flat, not vertical, curved, overlapping, designed so that snow and rain and wind would hit it and slide away rather than pressing through? And if you curved it enough, if you bent those arcs into a true vault, the structure itself would shed load, the way an arch sheds load, distributing weight outward and down, or instead of letting it accumulate and press directly on a flat surface below. The wind, she thought, the wind could not push against a curved surface the same way it pushed against a flat wall. It would have to go around. And underneath the iron insulation, the same principle as the double-layered wool cape, but in stone and wood and packed clay. The iron above keeping the snow and wind off the insulation holding the warmth in. Each layer doing what it was designed to do, and the whole system working because of how the layers related to each other, not despite it. She found the man handling the liquidation and asked him the price for all 14 plates: $11. She paid it without negotiating. $11 for a solution was $11 well spent. The man handling the sale looked at her with the expression people wore when they were trying to decide whether to say something and concluding that it was not their business. He took her money and wrote her a receipt. The man who helped her load the plates onto her wagon was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular stillness of someone who has done physical work long enough that it has become a form of rest. He had been with the shipyard for 2 decades, he said, and was now sorting out what remained to be sold before finding whatever came next. His name was Aldous. "You know, these are hull plates," he said, lifting the first one with the ease of long familiarity. "For a boat." "I know what they are," Nell said. "Most folks buy them to melt down." "I'm not most folks." He set the plate in the wagon bed and straightened up, looking at her with an expression that was half skepticism and half something that might have been professional respect. "What are you going to do with them?" "Build a roof." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the next plate and positioned himself to lift it. "These things get cold. Iron in winter, it draws the cold in." "Only if there's nothing between the iron and the living space," Nell said. "I'll insulate underneath. The iron keeps the snow and wind off. The insulation keeps the cold from coming through." Aldous looked at her. He was not a man given to quick assessments. He thought about what she had said for a genuine moment, turning it over with the same care he gave to every plate he was loading. Then he said, "You'll want to seal the overlaps. Iron this gauge. If you get water in the seams in autumn and it freezes, it'll push the plates apart from the inside come January." How do you seal them? He told her. Rendered animal fat mixed with fine ash and crushed charcoal heated until it was liquid and worked into the seams while hot. It was a technique the shipyard had used on below-waterline hull joints. Not elegant, not permanent, but effective against water penetration for years at a time. He described the ratios from memory, the way a craftsman describes something he has done thousands of times and no longer has to think about consciously. Nell memorized everything he said. She loaded the last plate herself, pushing it up the wooden ramp she had rigged from 2 planks, and when it was settled, she climbed up and checked that each plate was secured against movement on the road back. Then she climbed down and thanked Aldous, who nodded once and turned back to the yard. She drove back to Dakota Territory with 14 iron plates on her wagon and an idea that she had not told anyone about except a man she would never see again. And the idea sat with her on that 40-mile journey the way good ideas do, quietly, solidly, without the anxiety of something uncertain, because she had already turned it over enough times to know that it was sound. The trouble was going to be everyone else. Rutherford Becker Rudy, as everyone called him, was her nearest neighbor, a mile and a half to the west. He was 52 years old, a German-American farmer who had been homesteading in Dakota for 6 years and considered himself an authority on everything the territory had to teach, which was not entirely unjustified since 6 Dakota winters had in fact taught him a great deal. He was a large man, loud in the way that men who are actually kind often are, and he had helped Heinrich on several occasions and Nell on several more since Heinrich's death. He was also the kind of man who could not watch someone do something without telling them how to do it better. He came by 3 days after Nell returned from Omaha, ostensibly to check whether she needed help with the spring fencing, actually because word had already traveled. The way word always traveled in a settlement where people were spaced far enough apart that any new information became genuinely interesting, that old Nell Voss had come back from Omaha with a wagon load of iron. He stood in the yard looking at the plates stacked against the side of the cabin. He walked around them slowly. He crouched down and knocked his knuckle against one, listening to the sound it made. He stood back up. Iron, he said. Iron, Nell agreed. What are you going to do with it? Build a roof. The silence that followed was the silence of a man trying to decide whether to laugh and concluding that it would be impolite at least immediately. Nell, he said finally, and the way he said her name contained an entire argument. Iron gets cold, you know that? You touch iron in winter, it'll pull the heat right out of your hand. You put that over a cabin, you'll be colder inside than out. Not if it's insulated. With what? Mud and straw, same principle as the soddy walls, but under the iron instead of on top of it. The iron keeps the weight of snow off the insulation. The insulation keeps the heat in. Rudy looked at the plates. He looked at her. You've thought about this? I've thought about nothing else for a month. And the shape iron plates aren't flat. I know, they're curved. That's what I want. He waited. An arch, she said. I'll build a wooden frame curved ribs like the inside of a barrel and lay the plates over it. The curve will shed snow the same way a barrel sheds rain, and the arch itself will be stronger than a flat roof under load. A flat roof fails when the load gets heavy enough. An arch distributes the load outward to the walls. Rudy stared at her for what felt like a full minute. He was not a stupid man, and he understood the mechanics of what she was describing, at least in the rough way that a man who has built and repaired structures all his life understands structural principles without having the formal language for them. He could see that it was not nonsense. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. The walls, he said, you'd need walls that could take that load. Double walls, stone foundation, inner wall of vertical split logs, outer wall of horizontal logs, 6-inch gap between them, filled with insulation. Short walls only 5 feet high because the height comes from the arch. 5-foot walls. He said it slowly as if testing whether the words made sense. People won't be able to stand up. They will in the center. The arch peaks at 12 feet. You stand in the middle of the room and you've got 12 feet of headroom. You sleep at the sides where the ceiling is low. You don't need headroom to sleep. Another long silence. Rudy pulled his hat off and ran his hand over his head and put his hat back on. It's going to look strange. It's going to keep those children alive through winter, Nell said. There was no heat in her voice, no plea, no anger, just the flat certainty of a statement of fact. I'm not asking you to like how it looks. I'm asking you to help me build it. He looked at her. She looked back. I can't, he said. I've got my own fencing, my own repairs. I can't commit to something like this. I'm not asking you to commit today, Nell said. I'm asking you to think about it. He went home. He thought about it. He would come back. She knew he would come back because Rudy Becker was underneath everything. A decent man and decent men in Dakota Territory could not watch a 64-year-old widow attempt dangerous construction work alone without eventually showing up to help, whether they approved of the project or not. But that was still weeks away. In the meantime, she had work to do. The ground thawed in late April, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the grudging piecemeal way that Dakota ground thaws, giving up its frost inch by inch, as if each layer requires separate negotiation. Nell tested it with a metal rod every morning, pressing it into the earth at the site she had chosen for the new structure, a spot 30 yards from the existing cabin with good drainage, and its back to the northwest where the worst weather came from. When the rod went down 18 inches without hitting resistance, she judged it ready. She had designed the foundation herself, working it out on paper through the winter months, a trench 2 feet deep and 8 inches wide, forming a rectangle 20 feet long and 16 feet wide. She would fill it with stones hauled from the creek bed 2 miles south, stones that would not shift and would not rot and would hold the double walls without settling unevenly. Uneven settling was the enemy of an arch. If the walls moved at different rates, the plates would buckle and the whole roof could fail. She started digging on the last day of April. The work was extraordinary in its difficulty. Dakota clay in spring is not dirt in any ordinary sense. It is a dense, heavy, root-threaded material that clings to the shovel and must be lifted and thrown rather than simply turned. Each full shovelful weighed close to 20 pounds. She worked in the mornings before the children were fully awake, stopping to make their breakfast and see them to their chores, then returning to the trench through the afternoon until the light failed. Her back registered the work with what she could only describe as outrage. Her shoulders ached in a way she had not felt since her years at the mill machinery. She was 64 years old, and she was doing the work of a much younger person, and her body communicated this fact continuously and without diplomacy. She kept going because the alternative was Dottie's pillow with its small, dark stain. Caleb helped where he could. He was 6 years old and could not lift a full shovel, but he could carry the smaller stones that Nell had already excavated from the trench, moving them to the side to be sorted later. He worked with the serious concentration of a child who understands that what is happening is important without fully understanding why, and Nell watched him sometimes from the corner of her eye while she dug this small, gray-eyed boy working alongside her in the spring mud, and something moved through her chest that she did not have a word for. Dottie watched from a distance for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, she came and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down at the trench and then at Nell. "Grandma Nell," she said, "what are you building?" Nell did not stop digging. "Something that keeps us warm. Warmer than the cabin. Much warmer." Dottie looked at the trench, which was so far just a rectangle of disturbed earth and removed clay. She looked at the iron plates stacked 30 feet away, already familiar to her, in the way that objects around a homestead become familiar, just part of the landscape, their strangeness absorbed by proximity. Then she picked up a small stone from the pile Caleb had been sorting and placed it carefully at the edge of the trench. "Then I'll help," she said. It took 11 days to complete the trench, then began the hauling of stone. 2 miles to the creek, 2 miles back, the wagon loaded as heavily as the horses could pull on the spring soft ground. Nell made the first trip alone on a Wednesday morning, arriving at the creek bed where the stones lay exposed at the water's edge, rounded and solid, the kind that rings true when you knock two together. She loaded by hand, bending and lifting until the wagon sat low on its springs and the horses shifted under the weight. She made 47 trips over the course of 3 weeks. The children came on most of them. Caleb rode on the wagon seat beside her and helped sort stones at the creek, learning quickly which ones were good, solid, uncracked, roughly fist-sized or larger, and which ones were not. Dottie, whose cough had eased somewhat in the warmer spring air, carried smaller stones in a bucket she had appointed as her personal contribution to the operation. By mid-May, the trench was filled. The stone foundation was solid level within 1/4 of an inch across its full length, packed so tightly that Nell could stand on any section of it without feeling any give at all. She stood on it one evening as the sun went down over the western prairie, the light going long and orange across the flat land, and she looked at what 3 weeks of hauling had produced. It was just stone in a trench. Nothing yet that anyone would recognize as anything. But she knew what it was going to become. She went inside. She made supper. She put the children to bed. She sat at the kitchen table by the dying light of the fire and looked at her hands scored and swollen, the joints aching with a depth that would not leave until summer. And she thought about Heinrich, who had wanted this land, who had believed in this country, who had died in a wall-plank cabin that could not keep the cold out. She thought about what she was going to say to him when she saw him again, whenever that was. She was going to tell him she had fixed it. She was going to tell him the children were warm. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning, she started on the walls. The walls went up in May. Not quickly. Nothing about this project moved quickly. Everything moved at the pace of a 64-year-old woman working in the wind-scoured middle of Dakota Territory with 2 children, helping where they could, and a body that registered every hour of labor the following morning with a detailed and unsparing accounting. But the walls went up. Nell had designed them over the winter months, working the specifics out on paper by firelight, while the cold pressed against the cabin walls and Dottie and Caleb slept in the back room. She had thought about insulation the way she had once thought about fabric, in terms of layers, gaps, what passes through and what does not. A single layer of wool stops some cold. 2 layers with air trapped between them stops considerably more. The air itself is the insulator. The material is just the container that holds the air in place. The principle translated directly to walls. She would build 2 walls, not one. An inner wall of vertical split logs, each one roughly 4 inches thick, set close together and chinked with clay. Then a gap of 6 inches. Then an outer wall of horizontal logs, staggered at the corners for strength, also chinked. The gap between the 2 walls would be filled with a mixture she had worked out carefully. Creek clay mixed with chopped straw, dried prairie grass, and horse manure. The manure had been Caleb's contribution, or rather his reaction to learning about it, which was the kind of pure delight that only a 6-year-old can produce upon discovering that a serious adult is planning to put horse manure in the walls of a house. He had laughed until he had to sit down. Then he had become the operation's most dedicated manure collector, filling buckets with a commitment that Nell found both useful and quietly entertaining. He reported his collections each evening with the gravity of a man delivering an important inventory. The mixture had to be packed into the gap in layers, each one pressed tight before the next was added. Air pockets were the enemy gaps of trapped air. In the wrong places would create cold channels through which heat could escape in thin, invisible streams. The whole point was to eliminate those channels, to make the wall so dense and continuous that the cold had nowhere to enter and the warmth had nowhere to leave. She cut the logs herself. Cottonwood from the stand along the creek felled in early May, when the wood still held spring moisture and would work more cleanly under the axe. She used a broad axe and a froe, splitting the rounds into planks with a patience that came from decades of working material with her hands. The textile mills had taught her that most of what people called skill was simply the willingness to keep going past the point where the work stopped being interesting. Rudy Becker appeared on the 3rd day of log cutting. He came without announcing himself, which was the Dakota way. You did not send word ahead. You simply arrived, and if your arrival was welcome, you stayed, and if it was not, you made an excuse and left. He tied his horse at the post near the existing cabin and walked over to where Nell was splitting a cottonwood round and stood watching for a moment before saying anything. "You started," he said. "I started 2 weeks ago," she said. She did not stop working. Foundation's done. Stone 2 feet deep, level across the whole perimeter. He walked the foundation, eyeing it with the attention of a man who has built enough things to know what good work looks like and has no interest in pretending otherwise when he sees it. He said nothing for a while. Then, "That's solid." "It has to be. The arch puts lateral load on the walls. If the foundation shifts, the plates buckle." "You understand arches." "I understand that a curved shape distributes force outward instead of straight down. I understand that an arch has been holding up stone bridges for 2,000 years. I don't need the mathematics to know that it works." Rudy was quiet again. He picked up one of the split log planks she had finished and held it, testing its weight and the straightness of the split. It was good work. He set it down. 5-foot walls, he said, looking at the foundation rectangle. You weren't joking about that. I never joke about construction. He almost smiled. Your neighbors are going to think you've lost your mind. My neighbors already think that. What they think doesn't change the physics. He looked at her for a long moment, this small, compact woman with the damaged hands and the unhurried movements, and the complete absence of any interest in being talked out of what she had decided to do. He picked up the other broad axe that was leaning against the log she had been splitting. Show me the wall design, he said. She showed him. She had drawn it on a piece of brown paper, a cross-section showing the inner wall, the gap, the outer wall, the insulation mixture, and the way the whole assembly would sit on the stone foundation. He studied it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. She could see him working through it, checking it against what he knew, looking for the place where it would fail. He did not find that place. The gap, he said, 6 inches. You can't get your arm in there to pack it once the outer wall goes up. I'll pack in layers as I build. Inner wall goes up first. Then I pack the insulation in sections. Then the outer wall boards go on section by section as the packing rises. You'll have to build both walls simultaneously. You can't finish one completely and then start the other. That's correct. He folded the paper and handed it back to her. I'll come 3 days a week, he said. Mornings. I can't give you more than that. 3 days a week is enough. He picked up the broad axe and positioned himself at the next round. I'm not saying I think this will work, he said. You don't have to say anything, Nell said. Just split. They worked side by side through that morning without talking much, which suited both of them. Rudy Becker was a man who communicated better through work than words, and Nell had long since stopped needing anyone's verbal agreement in order to proceed with something she had already decided to do. The wall work took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of cutting and splitting and setting and packing and checking and adjusting and going back to redo sections that had not packed correctly or where the outer boards had not seated flush against each other. The inner wall went up first, the vertical logs set in a shallow trench dug along the inside edge of the stone foundation. Each one braced while the clay chinking dried. Then the packing began. The mixture had to be made in batches, clay and straw and dried grass chopped fine with a spade. Then the manure added last, and everything worked together until it had the consistency of stiff bread dough. Nell mixed it in a wooden trough, working it with her hands, the material cold and heavy, and requiring constant pressure to keep it uniform. She would make a batch in the morning and pack it through the afternoon, pressing it into the gap between the walls in layers no thicker than 3 inches, each layer tamped solid before the next went in. Her hands, already damaged from the foundation digging and stone hauling, got worse. The clay dried them. The constant pressure against the dense material bruised the joints. She wrapped them each evening in cloth soaked in rendered fat and unwrapped them each morning and went back to work. There was no other option that she could see. Dottie, whose cough remained but had not worsened in the warmer weather, became the operations quality inspector. She had developed a method pressing her small palm flat against each completed section of wall and telling Nell whether it felt solid or whether there was any give. Children's hands, Nell discovered, were better sensors for this than adult hands that had accumulated too many layers of callus to feel subtle variations in density. 3 times Dottie found sections that felt wrong, soft spots, probable air pockets hidden inside the packed mixture, and 3 times Nell opened those sections and repacked them without complaint. The outer wall went up board by board alongside the packing, each horizontal log pinned to the inner wall with wooden pegs that spanned the gap, keeping the 2 walls in alignment as the structure rose. The whole assembly was slow and required constant checking with a level and a plumb line. By the time the walls reached 5 feet, the thing had begun to look like something. Low and strange and unlike any cabin anyone in the settlement had seen before, but something. A structure with clear intention behind it. The afternoon Rudy came by and found the walls finished at their 5-foot height. He stood back and looked at them for a while. There were 2 other men with him, neighbors who had been stopping by with increasing frequency as word of the project spread, not to help but to observe, in the way that people observe something they expect to fail because they want to be able to say they witnessed it. One of them, a younger man named Prescott, who farmed the land to the northeast, looked at the low walls and could not suppress the comment that had apparently been building in him since he arrived. Building a cabin for dwarfs, Nell. Your family going to spend the winter on their knees. Nell did not look at him. The height comes from the roof. What roof you going to stack? Those iron pieces up there. Somehow iron isn't lumber. You can't cut it to fit a roof, I'm not cutting it, I'm bending it. This produced the silence of people encountering an idea far enough outside their experience that they cannot immediately find the objection, which is different from the silence of people who have no objection. Rudy, who had heard the explanation before, said nothing. He was examining the walls with a craftsman's eye, checking the corners, checking the level. He knew the walls were good. He was not going to give Prescott the satisfaction of watching him argue against what he could see was solid work. Prescott and the other man left, eventually shaking their heads in the manner of people who are certain they will be proved right without being able to articulate exactly why. The wooden frame for the roof came next. Nell had been planning this since February. She had spent many evenings sketching the rib structure, curved members that would span from wall to wall, each one forming the arc that the iron plates would follow. The plates themselves were curved in a gentle arc designed to become the hull of a boat. She was going to use that existing curve, not fight it. Each wooden rib would be shaped to match the inside radius of the plates so that when a plate was laid across two adjacent ribs, it would seat solidly against both of them, with no gap, no flex, no place for water to pool and penetrate. Cutting cottonwood saplings while they were still green and bending them to shape while they held moisture was the technique she had settled on after testing 3 different approaches through the spring. A green cottonwood sapling 2 inches in diameter could be bent to a gentle arc without splitting if you worked it slowly, applying steady pressure over the course of an hour rather than trying to force it quickly. She built a bending form from scrap lumber. 2 anchor pegs set at the right distance apart a central post at the height of the intended arc and bent each rib carefully over the course of a morning, then left it tied in place to dry for 3 days before removing it. She made 16 ribs. The process took 2.5 weeks. Rudy helped raise them. The ribs sat in notches cut into the top of the double walls spanning the 16-foot width of the structure, spaced every 2 feet along the 20-foot length. When all 16 were in place, the skeleton of the thing finally showed itself, an upturned hull. The precise shape of the boat those iron plates had been meant to become, now inverted and sitting on a squat, double-walled box on the Dakota prairie. It was the first moment that Nell felt certain she was right. Not the stone foundation, not the packed walls, not the bent ribs individually, but the skeleton, assembled and standing. She could see it. She could see how the snow would hit those curves and run off rather than accumulate. She could see how the wind would come from the northwest and find no flat surface to press against, only the long and different slope of the arch, redirecting it overhead and away. She could see how the space inside would hold heat at the peak and radiate it slowly downward, and how a fire in the center would send warmth rising naturally to the highest point of the curve and then spread outward along the curved ceiling on both sides. She stood inside the skeleton that evening when the light was going and looked up through the bare ribs at the Dakota sky, and she thought, Heinrich, you would have seen it too. You would have seen it the same way I do. Then she went inside and made supper. The iron went up in July. This was where everything became dangerous. Each plate weighed close to 80 pounds. The peak of the arch was 12 feet above the ground at its highest point. There was no scaffolding. Scaffolding required lumber, and lumber cost money she did not have and would have taken time she did not want to spend. What she had was rope, a cottonwood pole braced as a lever arm against one of the wall ends, and Rudy Becker, and 2 other men who had agreed to help, with the understanding that what they were attempting was genuinely hazardous, and that everyone involved was accepting that fact voluntarily. She also had a system she had worked out over several evenings of careful calculation. The plates would go up from the bottom of the arch to the peak, each one overlapping the one below it by 6 inches, overlapping downward, so that water running off the plate above would shed onto the outer face of the plate below and continue running down, never finding a seam it could penetrate from above. The first plates at the bottom of the arch, where the curve began its rise from the wall, were the easiest. They sat at a low angle and could be walked up planks leaned against the wall. The plates near the peak were a different matter entirely. The first plate went up on a Tuesday morning in early July. It took 4 hours. They used 2 ropes, one at each end of the plate, running up over the peak of the wooden frame, and backways, the other side where Rudy and a neighbor named Greer held them. A third man guided the plate from below with a long wooden pole. Nell stood on a heavy ladder she had built from cottonwood poles lashed with rawhide, positioned at the spot where the plate needed to land, waiting to guide it into position and begin drilling the bolt holes. The drilling was the part no one had a good solution for. Each bolt hole had to pass through the iron plate through the layer of packed clay straw insulation. She had spread across the wooden ribs and into the rib itself a total depth of nearly 5 inches through 3 different materials with varying resistance. She used a brace and bit, the largest she owned, and leaned her full weight into each revolution. With the plate held by ropes above her head, each hole took 10 minutes of sustained effort. Every plate needed 6 bolts. Every plate was suspended overhead while she drilled. Dottie and Caleb had been sent to stay with a neighboring family for the duration of the ironwork. Nell had not explained precisely why, but Dottie, who was sharp about such things, had understood well enough. She had held Nell's wrapped hands for a moment before leaving, not saying anything, just holding them with both of her small hands, and Nell had looked at this 8-year-old girl with her serious eyes and thought, "You are going to be all right. Whatever happens here, you are going to be all right." The first 4 plates went up without serious incident, slowly sweating in the July heat, stopping to rest when arms gave out, going back to the ladder when strength returned. The system worked, and it was not elegant, and it was not fast, but it worked. The 5th plate almost ended everything. They had raised it to position Rudy and Greer on the ropes, the third man guiding with the pole below Nell on the ladder waiting to receive it. It was nearly seated. She had reached out to guide its lower edge into alignment with the overlap on the plate below, when the rope on Rudy's end slipped in his hands, not broke, slipped the hemp wet with sweat, and the load suddenly redistributing, and the plate swung hard to the right, hit the wooden frame with a sound like a struck church bell, and fell. Rudy was below and to the left of where it came down. He moved on pure instinct, throwing himself sideways, not calculating, not choosing, just moving the way the body moves when the body has made a decision ahead of the conscious mind. The plate hit the packed earth where he had been standing. It went into the ground 2 inches. The iron rang once against a buried stone and went silent. Nobody moved for a moment. The sound faded across the open prairie. The July wind came through as if nothing had happened. Rudy was on his hands and knees 6 feet from where the plate had landed. He looked at it. He looked at the 2-inch gouge it had made in the hard-packed earth. He stayed on his hands and knees for a long time, just breathing. "I'm done," he said finally. He got to his feet. His voice was flat and entirely certain. "This is going to kill someone. I'm not going to be the one who watches it happen." Nell climbed down the ladder. Her legs were shaking. She had not let them shake while she was on the ladder, but they shook now and she let them. She walked across the yard and stood near Rudy, close enough to speak privately, but not in the way of a person seeking comfort. She did not argue with him. She did not tell him the system was safe because it was not safe, and they both knew it. She did not offer assurances that nothing like this would happen again because she could not know that either. She said, "Dottie coughed blood on her pillow in January." Rudy looked at her. Same pillow Heinrich died beside. Same cabin. Same cold coming through the same walls. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without theater, without asking for anything. "I'm going to finish this roof. I'm going to finish it if I have to do it alone, 1 plate at a time, which will take me the rest of the summer, and I will probably fall, and I may not survive the fall. I'm not asking you to stay to spare me difficulty. I'm asking you to stay because if I fall, those 2 children will be alone in Dakota Territory with winter coming." The prairie was quiet around them. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass sang its 3 notes and stopped. Rudy looked at the plate that had nearly killed him. He looked at the wooden skeleton standing above the low walls, 9 plates still to go, the frame waiting in the afternoon sun. He bent down and picked up his end of the rope. "If another one falls toward me," he said, "I'm walking away and I'm not coming back." "Understood," Nell said. They developed better procedures after that. Nell built a series of wooden catch brackets, simple L-shaped supports bolted temporarily to the ribs, so that each plate could be rested in place before the final bolts went in, sitting in its brackets, while she drilled rather than hanging from ropes overhead. The system added 2 hours to each plate's installation and reduced the danger from catastrophic to merely serious. It was the best she could do with what she had. 2 more plates gave them significant trouble. The first had been warped by storage. It would not conform to the rib curve without being reshaped, which meant building a large enough fire to get the iron red hot and then hammering it against a shaped wooden form, while three men worked simultaneously to correct the curve before the metal cooled back to rigidity. They ruined that plate completely on the first attempt and had to start again, and the ruined plate lay in the grass for the rest of the summer as a monument to the cost of a single mistake when there is no margin for error. The second problem plate developed a crack along one edge when they tried to drill too close to it. The iron had a hidden flaw, a line of internal stress invisible from outside, and the pressure of the drill opened it. They worked around it, positioning that plate where the crack would be fully covered by the overlap of the plate installed above it. 6 weeks. That was how long the ironwork took from the first plate to the last. 6 weeks of climbing and drilling and seating and bolting and applying the sealant compound that Aldous had described in the Omaha yard, the rendered fat and ash and crushed charcoal, heated over a small fire to liquid, worked into every seam with a stiff brush, while it was still hot enough to penetrate the gap. Nell applied it herself, moving across the completed sections of the arch with care because she understood that a missed seam would announce itself in February with a line of ice forming inside the living space directly below it, and by February it would be too late to do anything about it. Her hands by August were things she barely recognized. The burns from the sealant work overlapped the cuts from the iron edges, which overlapped the blisters from the rope work, which sat on top of the damage already done by the foundation, digging and the stone hauling and the log splitting. 6 months of labor had left their complete record on her hands, and the record was not a pleasant one. Rudy wrapped them for her one evening. She could not quite manage the bandaging herself that day, and he did it carefully without comment, working around the worst of the damage with the attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. When he was done, he held her hands for a moment in both of his, looking at them. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the hands themselves did not already say better than words could. The structure was complete in late August of 1879, just as the summer heat was finally beginning to ease and the first hints of autumn came in on the northwest wind. It was the strangest thing standing anywhere in Dakota Territory. The walls were only 5 feet high, the height of a short man's shoulder, built from rough-hewn cottonwood logs in their double-wall configuration, sitting on the stone foundation. Above the walls, the iron arch rose to 12 feet at its peak, the overlapping plates dark with rust and streaked with the remains of the original black shipyard paint the seams dark where the sealant had cured hard. It looked like a loaf of bread made of iron and wood. It looked like a mine entrance built above ground. It looked like nothing anyone in Dakota Territory had seen before because nothing like it had been built there before. Rudy stood outside it with his arms crossed, looking at it from 30 feet away in the late afternoon light. "It's ugly," he said. "Yes," Nell agreed. "It looks like something fell out of a city and landed in a field. It's going to keep those children warm." "You don't know that yet." "No," she said. "Not yet." She moved Dottie and Caleb into it the second week of September. The interior was unlike anything they had lived in before. The low-ceilinged sides where she had built the sleeping platforms felt enclosed and safe in the way that a ship's berth feels enclosed and safe. The central space where the arch peaked opened upward 12 feet and made the room feel larger than its footprint suggested. The stone fireplace she had built against the east wall had its chimney running straight up through a sealed penetration in the arch peak. And when the fire was lit, the warmth rose immediately to the highest point of the curve and then spread outward along both sides of the ceiling and descended slowly, filling the whole volume of the space rather than accumulating uselessly at one level. It worked the way she had known it would work because she had thought about it long enough. The summer's heat, however, had already proven one thing that her neighbors had been predicting since March. Iron in direct sun is uncompromising in its collection of heat. Through August, the interior had climbed past 95 degrees Fahrenheit on clear afternoons, despite the insulation layer beneath the plates. The ventilation openings at both gabled ends helped but did not solve the problem entirely. The children had spent the hottest hours of the hottest days back in the old cabin, which was drafty and inadequate, but at least not actively functioning as a solar collector. Prescott, the neighbor who had made the crack about dwarfs, came by in late August and found Nell sitting in the shade of the old cabin, watching the iron arch in the afternoon heat. He said what everyone had been saying. Nell let him say it. When he left, Rudy, who had been stacking firewood nearby and had heard the exchange without participating in it, walked over and sat down in the shade beside Nell. He was quiet for a moment, then, "It's going to be different in winter." It was the first time he had said anything suggesting he believed she might actually be right. "Yes," she said, "the same metal that collects the sun's heat in summer will hold the fire's heat in winter, the mass of it. Once the iron warms, it holds. And the arch will hold the snow, and the snow will add insulation rather than weight the frame can't bear." He nodded slowly, working through it. "You knew about the summer before you built it." "I knew. I decided winter mattered more." He sat with that for a while. Sitting down in the middle of a working afternoon was something Rudy Becker did not do casually. It was a concession that something had earned his sustained attention. They sat together in the shade without talking, looking at the strange iron structure standing in the late summer heat of the Dakota prairie. "October," he said finally. "We'll know something in October." "We'll know what we need to know in December," Nell said. She was right about that. October came to Dakota territory the way a debt collector comes, without apology, ahead of schedule, and with full intention of collecting everything owed. The first hard frost arrived on the 14th. By the 23rd, the thermometer outside Nell's old cabin read 0 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, and the creek 2 miles south had frozen over at the shallows. The prairie grass, which had stood brown and dry through September, was now pressed flat under a thin skin of ice that caught the morning light and threw it back in cold pieces. Nell had been keeping records since the 1st of October. Every morning before she started the fire, she went to the thermometer hung on the north-facing wall of the iron-roof structure, shaded from any direct sun, giving the truest possible reading of the interior air temperature, and wrote down what it said. Then she walked to the old cabin and wrote down that reading too. Then she went back inside, started the fire, and waited 40 minutes before taking a third reading from the iron structure with the fire going. She did this every morning without exception. The notebook was a school composition book she had bought in Yankton 2 years earlier, half used by Dottie for arithmetic practice. On one side of the pages, Nell's temperature records in careful columns on the other. 2 generations of careful attention to numbers sharing the same paper. On the morning of October 23rd, with the outside temperature at 0 Fahrenheit, the iron roof structure read 27 degrees before the fire was lit. The old cabin, which Nell no longer slept in, but still used for storage and as a workspace, read 18 degrees. 9 degrees of difference before any fire at all, from nothing but the mass of the walls and the arch and the insulation packed between them, doing its quiet work through the night. She wrote it down. She went back inside. She built the fire. By the time Dottie and Caleb came out from under their blankets on the sleeping platforms along the low-ceiling sides, the interior had climbed to 41 degrees. Not warm, not comfortable by any standard that people in gentler climates would recognize. But Dottie got out of bed without coughing. Caleb's feet, when he pulled on his socks, were cold, but not the blue-white cold that had sent Nell to the basin for warm water every morning of the previous 2 winters. He did not wince. He pulled on his socks and went to the fireplace and held out his hands to the warmth, and that was the whole of it. They ate breakfast with their coats on, sitting close to the fireplace. The fire was the same modest fire Nella had been banking through the night, not a roaring blaze, not the desperate maximum output burning that characterized winter mornings in conventional cabins. A reasonable fire. A fire that a person of moderate strength could sustain through an entire winter without burning through the woodpile by January. Rudy came by that afternoon. He had taken to stopping in more frequently as the cold settled in, not to check on the project, she understood, but to check on them. He was a man who would not say directly that he was concerned about 3 people living in an experimental iron structure, but who would drive 1.5 miles out of his way on a working afternoon to establish that everything was all right. She showed him the notebook. He stood in the iron roof structure reading through the October entries, and she watched his face move through something that was not quite surprise. He had believed her enough by now to expect results, but was still the quiet particular to a man confronting evidence that repositions what he thought he understood. 27 before the fire, he said, every morning this week. Outside was between 0 and 8 degrees. My cabin was running 14-15 degrees before I lit the stove. I know, I asked Edna when she came by on Tuesday. He looked up from the notebook. almost smiled. "You've been collecting comparison data." "Since October 1st. He handed the notebook back. He looked around at the low walls curving up into the iron arch above the fireplace with its modest fire, the sleeping platforms where Dottie had arranged her small collection of objects, a smooth stone from the creek, a piece of blue glass she had found in the road, two books with broken spines that Nell had repaired with glued cloth. The interior was dim in the way all small windowed structures are dim, but it was not the darkness of a place sealed against the world in desperation. It was the darkness of a place that was simply quietly keeping something in. "November," he said. "We'll see how it holds when it gets serious." November came. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero on the third night of the month. Nell's notebook recorded 43 degrees inside with a small fire burning through the night. Rudy's cabin, by his own report the following morning, had dropped to 22 degrees, despite him stoking the stove twice after midnight. He did not say anything specific about that. He just looked at her and she looked back, and that was the conversation they needed to have. December arrived on a Sunday. The sky on the 1st of December was the color of a cast iron pan, not the dramatic dark gray of a storm approaching, just the flat sealed, characterless gray of a sky that has decided to withhold everything indefinitely. The wind came from the northwest and had a quality that experienced Dakota settlers recognized and named among themselves the dead wind. Not howling, not gusting, just a steady and unrelenting pressure that found every gap and every weakness and pressed through it without hurry and without mercy. It was the wind that killed by accumulation rather than by violence. Nell cut and split an extra cord of wood that first week of December. She had always planned to. Her woodpile was already larger than any of her neighbors thought was reasonable because she had spent the summer calculating rather than assuming. She knew how much wood a modest fire in the stone fireplace required per hour. She knew approximately how many hours were in a Dakota winter. She had added 30% to that number because she understood that her calculations could be wrong and winters could exceed expectations, and then she had cut and split until the pile matched the number she had arrived at. Her neighbors thought she was being excessive. She thought they were being optimistic. On the evening of December 7th, the wind shifted. She felt it before she could explain why she felt it. Some change in the quality of the sound the air made against the iron arch above her, some deepening in the cold that seeped through the ventilation shutters she had almost fully closed. She went outside at dusk to check the thermometer, and the cold struck her face like a flat board. Not the cold of November, which had been serious, but something a person could stand in for several minutes before turning back. This was different in kind from anything she had felt before. It had weight. It pressed against her face and her lungs and the exposed skin of her wrists between coat and gloves. And in the 30 seconds she stood at the thermometer, she understood with complete physical certainty that something had changed in the fundamental nature of the season. The thermometer read 14 below zero, and the mercury was still falling. She went back inside. She built the fire up, not to its maximum, not yet, but larger than the previous nights. She checked that the ventilation shutters were closed to their smallest useful opening, just enough for the fire to draw, without starving the interior of oxygen. She put a second blanket on each sleeping platform. She filled the water barrel from the indoor water crock before the deepening night cold could complicate the task further. Then she sat down by the fire, picked up her mending, and waited for what was coming. It came on the 8th of December. The temperature in the pre-dawn hours of December 8th reached 49 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. That was the reading at the military post, 20 miles to the south, recorded by an officer who kept meticulous daily records and who noted in his journal that the mercury had been dropping in increments that exceeded anything in his experience of Dakota winters. Some settlers would later claim the temperature reached 55 below in the exposed open prairie away from any windbreak. There was no reliable instrument at those locations to confirm or deny it, and in any case, the difference between 49 below and 55 below was largely academic to anyone who had to live through either one. What could be confirmed was this: it was the coldest night in living memory across the territory. The kind of cold that changes what the word cold means. The cottonwood trees along the creek split open in the night, not crack split. The sound carried across the flat prairie like rifle shots one after another through the darkness, the frozen sap inside the wood expanding beyond what the wood could contain until the wood simply came apart. Settlers lying awake in their cabins heard these sounds, and some of them, in the confused logic of half-sleep and extreme cold, thought someone was shooting. A cup of water thrown into the air at midnight would have frozen before it hit the ground, the droplets converting to ice crystals in the air itself and falling as a small cloud of frozen dust that hung for a moment before settling. No one was outside at midnight to try this. Anyone outside at midnight on December 8th in Dakota Territory was making the last mistake of their life. Inside Nell's iron-roof structure, the fire burned steadily in the stone fireplace. She had been up since 2 in the morning feeding it. Not in panic, methodically, deliberately adding wood at intervals she had calculated to maintain a consistent heat output without burning through her supply faster than necessary. The fire she was running was not a large fire by any emergency standard. It was a fire designed for sustained duration, the kind a person of moderate strength could maintain indefinitely, adding wood every hour, banking it during the hours she needed to rest, rebuilding it when she woke. A fire designed for the long months of a Dakota winter, rather than the immediate crisis of a single terrible night. The iron arch above her held the warmth the way a cupped hand holds water. Heat rose from the fireplace to the peak of the arch, 12 feet up, directly above the center of the room, and then spread outward along the curved ceiling, descending slowly along both sloping sides in a continuous, gentle circulation that kept the air throughout the entire interior within a few degrees of itself. There were no cold corners where the heat never reached. There were no drafts coming through gaps in the chinking. The double walls with their packed insulation stopped the outside cold at the wall face and held it there, and the iron arch caught the warmth before it could escape upward through the roof and kept it cycling back into the room. The thermometer on the interior wall read 48 degrees at 3 in the morning, 49 at 5. At 7, with the fire rebuilt, after its banking, it read 51. Dottie slept through the entire night without coughing once. Caleb slept with his feet, the feet that had developed chilblains the 2 previous winters, from sleeping in temperatures that should not have been survivable, tucked under a single blanket, and woke up warm. Nell sat by the fire through most of the night, not sleeping much, listening to the cottonwoods split in the darkness and the wind work against the outside of the arch and find nothing to penetrate, nothing to press through, only the long, indifferent curve of the iron, redirecting it overhead and away. She thought about Heinrich, which she often did in the deep night hours of winter. She thought about how he had sat by the fire in the old cabin on the coldest nights, wrapped in every coat he owned, and how the cold had come in anyway around the warped boards, and through the gaps in the chinking, and through the single-layer roof, patient and relentless and entirely indifferent to Heinrich's fire or Heinrich's desire to survive. She thought, not this time. Not this time. 200 yards to the west, Rutherford Becker's cabin was losing the fight. The temperature inside had been dropping through the night, despite the cast-iron stove running at its full capacity. By midnight, it had reached 28 degrees inside the cabin. By 2 in the morning, it was 24. Rudy had been burning wood at a rate that he understood with the arithmetic clarity of a man watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, would exhaust his woodpile within 3 days if the cold held. He had burned a chair on the second night, taken it apart with his hands because there was no time for tools, and fed the pieces to the stove one by one, and watched the temperature hold at 26 degrees for an hour before it began dropping again. He looked at the table. He looked at his wife Edna, who was sitting wrapped in every blanket in the house, and at his 3 children, the oldest 2 old enough to understand what was happening, and frightened because they understood it, and the youngest, a girl of 6 named Hattie, young enough not to understand, and frightened simply because everyone around her was frightened. Hattie had fallen asleep sitting upright against her mother's side. It was Hattie's feet that made the decision. Edna lifted the blanket to move Hattie to the bed and found the child's feet cold, not the ordinary cold of a child who has been sitting still in a cold room, but the specific dead cold of skin that has stopped doing what skin is supposed to do. 3 toes on the right foot had gone white, not the pink and red cold that aches when it warms up. White. The color that means tissue has been denied what it needs for long enough that the outcome is no longer certain. Rudy looked at his daughter's white toes for a long moment. He was a man who moved through crisis slowly and deliberately. He had learned through experience that speed without direction rarely improved outcomes. He pulled Hattie's sock back on with careful hands. He wrapped her feet in the blanket. He stood up and put on every piece of clothing he owned, one layer over another, until he could barely bend his arms. He picked up his daughter. He opened the cabin door. The cold outside was not a temperature. It was a presence, something with mass and purpose, something that pressed against the exposed skin of his face in the first seconds between the doorframe and the open air and began its work without any delay. He could feel it on his cheekbones and across his forehead and in his lungs, which pulled back slightly against air that was close to 80 degrees colder than what he had been breathing inside. 200 yards. He had walked it easily 100 times. In summer, it was nothing a pleasant 2-minute walk less if he moved with purpose. In the dark at 49 below zero, carrying an armful of child, and with no feeling remaining in his face after the first 30 seconds, 200 yards became an exercise in the reduction of the entire world to a single point of focus, the light in Nell's east window. She kept a lantern burning in the small window at the east gabled end of the structure, the end that faced toward the Becker homestead. He had never asked her why she kept it there through the winter nights. He had not needed to ask. He walked toward the light. At 100 yards, his hands inside their double-layered gloves had lost most specific sensation. He could feel Hattie's weight, but not the individual pressure of his fingers around her. He monitored his grip by watching his arms, rather than trusting what his hands reported. His face had gone silent, in the way that very cold things go silent. It was present, he presumed, but it had stopped sending information. At 150 yards, he was counting his steps. Not because he needed to count to navigate, the light was directly ahead and entirely clear, but because counting gave the functioning part of his mind something to do, besides register the quality of the cold, which had moved past unpleasant and past painful, and into a third state that he recognized with the portion of his thinking that was still working clearly as somewhere he did not want to remain any longer than he had to. He reached the door. He raised one arm and knocked with the side of his fist. The sound was muffled by his gloves and by the peculiar acoustic quality of extreme cold in which sound travels reluctantly, as though even the air has become too dense and stiff for easy vibration. The door opened. Nell stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand. She looked at Rudy. She looked at the bundle in his arms. She stepped back without saying a word and held the door open wide. He came inside. The warmth of the interior met his face immediately, not the desperate heat of a room that has been pushed to its emergency limits, but the steady, even warmth of a space that had been maintaining itself all night, without strain, 48 degrees of still air, that against the memory of what he had just walked through felt like stepping into a well-heated room in a comfortable house in a city that had never learned what winter truly meant. He stood just inside the door and did not move. Dottie and Caleb were awake. His knock had woken them, sitting up on their sleeping platforms with blankets pulled around their shoulders, watching Rudy and the bundle he was carrying, with the wide, careful eyes of children who understand that something serious is happening without knowing precisely what. Nell set the lantern down and crossed to Rudy and took Hattie from his arms. She carried the child to the fireplace and sat in the chair beside it, unwrapping the blankets from around the small feet. The white toes had not changed in color from the walkover, neither better nor worse, which meant the cold had not advanced further during the 200 yards. She held the child's feet in both her hands, not rubbing. Rubbing frostbitten tissue does damage just holding them. Her warm palms pressed steadily against the cold skin, letting the warmth transfer slowly and thoroughly. Rudy had not moved from inside the door. "Go back," Nell said without looking up from Hattie. "Bring Edna and the other children. The temperatures are still dropping. Your cabin will not make it through tonight." Rudy looked around the interior of the iron-roofed structure. He looked at the arch above the steady, modest fire, the thermometer on the wall that he could just read from where he stood, 48 degrees, unchanged by his entrance, unchanged by the open door, the combined thermal mass of the walls and insulation and iron, absorbing the brief intrusion without complaint. He looked at Dottie sitting on her sleeping platform with her blanket around her shoulders and her feet tucked under her, watching him with her dark eyes. No cough, just watching. He went back for his family. The walk back was harder than the walk over. He had spent something in the first crossing that did not fully return during his brief time in the warmth, some reserve the cold had drawn from him, that the 48-degree interior had not had time to restore. But he made it. He brought Edna and the two older children back across the 200 yards, and they came through Nell's door in a group pressed together, breathing invisible clouds. 7 people in a structure built for 3. The temperature inside dropped 2 degrees when the door opened and closed 3 times in succession to admit them all. It climbed back to 46 within 20 minutes. The fire did not need to be rebuilt or increased. It simply continued doing what it had been doing all night, burning at a steady and sustainable pace, sending warmth up into the arch and letting the arch distribute it, the whole system working exactly as it had been designed to work. Edna sat beside the fireplace with Hattie in her lap. Nell moved through the crowded interior heating water for tea-making room, where room could be made arranging blankets from the sleeping platforms for the older children. There was not space for everyone to sleep comfortably. There was space for everyone to survive, which was the only measurement that mattered on that particular night. They stayed through the night of the 8th and through the full day and night of the 9th. During those 36 hours, 4 people died in the surrounding settlement. A woman named Clara Prentice, 23 years old and 7 months along with her first child, died trying to reach her barn to tend a cow that had gone into labor. She made it 40 yards from her cabin door. Her husband found her the next morning, one arm extended in the direction of the barn she had never reached. The cow died. The calf was born dead into a barn that no longer had anyone to tend it. An elderly man named Sven Gustafsson, who lived alone in a soddy 4 miles to the north, died in his bed when his fire went out sometime during the first night. His neighbors found him 3 days later frozen beneath his blankets in a position of such apparent peace that for a moment they thought he was sleeping. He was 71 years old and had survived 6 Dakota winters. The 7th found the one gap in his preparation that the previous 6 had not found. A family named Hooper lost 2 children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 7, to what the doctor who came through a week later determined was carbon monoxide poisoning. In their desperation to stop the cold from entering the family, had sealed every gap in their cabin walls with cloth and rags and anything else at hand until no outside air could enter. The stove had slowly consumed the oxygen in the sealed room and replaced it with something invisible and lethal that killed quietly without pain while the family slept. The parents woke. The children did not. They would carry that night with them for the rest of their lives without speaking of it. The Dunmore family 3 miles to the east lost their roof on the night of the 8th. The combined weight of 3 feet of packed snow and ice pressing down on roof beams that had become brittle in the extreme cold caused 2 main supports to fail simultaneously. The roof did not collapse entirely. It sagged catastrophically in the center and held, but the gaps that opened between the failed sections let the outside air pour in and the interior temperature drop to outside levels within an hour. The family broke through a window and ran to a neighbor's cabin in their nightclothes, losing everything except themselves. Nell learned all of this over the following days as the cold finally and reluctantly began to ease, and people moved through the settlement, accounting for the living and the dead, checking on those who had not been seen, trying to understand what the storm had taken and what it had chosen to leave. She listened to each account standing in doorways or beside wagon wheels, letting people tell what they had seen and survived and lost. She did not say anything about her own structure or her own experience of those 4 days. She was not built for that kind of talking. On the morning of December 11th, the temperature outside had climbed back to 8 below zero. Not warm, not safe for extended exposure without full protection, but survivable in a way that the previous 4 days had not been. And in Dakota Territory, that distinction meant everything. Rudy brought his family home across the 200 yards in daylight, their breath-making clouds in the still air. Hattie walking on her own feet, the toes had recovered, 2 of them, showing the deep bruised discoloration of tissue that had been very close to serious and permanent damage, but had been caught at the edge of it and brought back. He stopped at his own cabin door and turned back and stood looking at the iron roof structure, sitting in the winter morning light, its low walls and massive arched roof dark against the white of the snow-covered prairie, looking strange and out of place in exactly the same way it had always looked strange and out of place. He crossed the yard back to Nell. She was at the woodpile, methodically adding to the stack she had drawn down over 4 days of continuous fire. He stood and watched her for a moment. His hands were wrapped in cloth bandages. 3 fingers on his left hand had gone white and then gray during his crossings in the extreme cold. And the doctor who came through 2 days later would tell him with careful and honest language that he had lost some function in those fingers that was unlikely to return fully. He would have diminished sensation in them for the rest of his life. He would learn to compensate. "How cold did it get inside?" he asked. 46 at the lowest. The night you came with Hattie." She did not stop stacking wood. It came back up to 48 within the hour. Rudy was quiet for a moment. He looked at his bandaged hands. He looked at the arch. My cabin was at 22. I burned through 2 months of firewood in 4 days. Burned a chair. Was calculating whether I could burn the table and still be able to eat sitting on the floor. Nell stacked another piece of wood. Hattie's toes, he said. He stopped. Started again. The doctor said another hour in those temperatures, and she would have lost 2 of them permanently. He paused. You had 46 degrees in here. We had 22 out there. Yes. That's not luck, he said. That's not something that happened by accident or by chance or because you got fortunate with the wind direction. That's the difference between a thing that works and a thing that doesn't. Nell set down the piece of wood she was holding. She went inside. When she came back, she was carrying the composition book, one with Dottie's arithmetic practice on one side of the pages and 6 weeks of temperature records in careful columns on the other. She held it out to him. He took it with his bandaged hands and opened it. He read slowly, working through the columns of dates and temperatures inside readings and outside readings before the fire was lit, and after it had been burning for an hour, comparing numbers across 6 weeks of October and November that led to this December. 42 mornings of measurements taken before dawn, before the fire in the truest cold of the night. 42 evenings recorded after an hour of modest fire. The numbers did not argue or persuade. They simply were what they were morning after morning, and what they were was consistent and clear and entirely without ambiguity about what they meant. The iron roof structure was not a lucky accident, and it was not a fluke of one extraordinary night. It was a system that worked documented across 6 weeks of actual Dakota winter, by a woman who had sat down every morning before the sun came up and written the numbers down in a composition book that her 8-year-old granddaughter used for arithmetic practice on the other side. Rudy closed the book. He held it for a moment, looking at it, then looked at the arch. I burned a chair, he said again quietly. It was not directed at Nell. It was the sound a man makes when something has finally settled fully into understanding. He held the book out. She took it. He looked at her, this small, compact, damaged-handed woman who had spent a year building something that everyone around her had said was wrong and foolish and dangerous and ugly, who had built it anyway with whatever help she could persuade, and a great deal of it accomplished alone, before anyone agreed to show up, who had kept records through all of it, because she had known from the beginning that the numbers would eventually matter more than any argument she could make. Can you show me how to build one? He said. Nell looked at him steadily. Iron is $18 now. Prices went up over the summer. I know. That's more than you have liquid agate now. I'll sell the gray horse. I can get 12 for him from Halverson, maybe 14 if I hold out. I can get the rest from the spring grain sale. A pause. I can't do another winter like that one, Nell. I can't watch Hattie's toes go white again and stand there not knowing whether they're coming back. She looked at him for a long moment. Come in the spring, she said. After the ground thaws, I'll show you everything. Word moved through the settlement in the way that useful information moves through communities of people who depend on each other faster than anyone intends and with more detail than anyone planned to share, gathering context as it traveled, losing some accuracy but gaining the weight of lived experience. By Christmas, 5 families had come to Nell directly asking for details about the structure. They came to stand outside it in the December cold and look at the iron arch, and they saw something. Now that they had not been able to see in the summer when they had stopped by to shake their heads at the strange thing the old Voss widow was constructing. They had seen foolishness in July. They saw shelter in December. The same structure, the same iron, the same low walls that Prescott had mocked. Different eyes because the cold had taught them what they had declined to learn any other way. Prescott himself came on a Thursday afternoon in late December alone without the other man who had accompanied him in the summer. He stood outside for a while without saying anything. Then he came to the door and knocked, and when Nell opened it, he looked at her with an expression that cost him something and said, I heard about the Hooper children. I heard about old Gustafson. He paused. I heard about what temperature you kept in here those 4 days. Nell waited. I was wrong about the walls, he said. I'm not too proud to say it. Nell stepped back and held the door open. Come in, she said. I'll show you the notebook. By spring of 1883, families in the settlement were building iron roof structures based on Nell's design. Not all of them succeeded on the first attempt. One family skimped on-the-wall insulation to save labor and found the structure colder than expected when November came. Another built the arch at too steep an angle and had trouble with the wooden ribs developing cracks under the lateral stress the steeper angle produced. Nell went to both, looked at the problems without making anyone feel worse about them than they already did, and explained in her plain way what needed to be corrected and why. The design evolved as it passed from builder to builder, the way useful designs always evolve, absorbing modifications that worked, shedding those that did not, retaining the core principles that the first structure had proven. Some builders used corrugated sheet metal for the arch instead of hull plates, which was lighter, more available, and easier to work with. Some built the sidewalls taller before the arch began gaining usable vertical space at the cost of some structural efficiency. Some applied the arch principle to barn construction rather than cabins, because livestock losses in a Dakota winter could ruin a family as completely as human losses, and a barn that held heat was worth nearly as much as a cabin that did. The core principle traveled with the design wherever it went: the arch, the double walls, the packed insulation, the fireplace designed specifically for the curved space rather than adapted from the flat ceiling convention. 8 years later, in the brutal winter of 1887, another killing season that historians would record as among the worst in the territory's documented history, Nell's original iron-roofed structure had been standing for 8 winters. The iron had rusted through in 3 places, and she had patched them with flat sheet metal and fresh sealant applied in the method Aldous had described in the Omaha yard. One wooden rib had developed a crack and been reinforced with a new section of cottonwood cut to fit alongside the old one. The stone foundation had not shifted by any measurable amount. During the worst week of that winter of 1887, the structure sheltered 14 people. Nell and the 2 children, Dottie now 15 and Caleb 13, and 4 other families whose own buildings had failed in one way or another under the assault of snow and load and cold and time. 14 people in a space built for 3 sleeping in organized shifts the fire maintained in a continuous relay, the iron arch above them holding warmth in and cold out through every hour of every night of that terrible week. They all survived. The community that had watched Nell Voss haul iron plates across the Dakota prairie and build something that looked like a mine entrance on her homestead did not forget what those 4 days in December of 1879 had cost and what they had been spared. Memory in that country ran deep because the winters ran deep. And what had happened in those 4 days was the kind of thing that gets told at kitchen tables for generations. The details sharpening rather than fading, because the details matter in a place where the difference between the right detail and the wrong one is sometimes the difference between being alive and not. Nell Voss lived in that structure until 1901, when she was 86 years old, and her body finally made the decision that her will had been contesting for several years. Dottie was 29 by then, married with children of her own, living on land adjacent to the homestead. She was there when Nell died, in the same structure Nell had built by hand in her 64th year, in the same Dakota territory that had taken Heinrich and had tried to take Dottie and Caleb, and had been turned back by a woman with $11 a notebook and an idea about the way a wool cape sheds rain. The structure itself outlasted her by decades. New owners came when Dottie finally sold the land in 1909, and they patched what needed patching and used the structure for storage because it was solid and weathertight, in a way that newer buildings were not always solid or weathertight, and because the people who used it did not necessarily know or care what it had originally been built for, or by whom. It was simply there as it had always been, squat and strange and dark with age, looking like something deposited in that field by a world that operated by different rules than the ones surrounding it. It was finally torn down in 1954, 75 years after its construction, when the land was sold to a developer who wanted the ground cleared. The iron plates were sold as scrap metal and melted down for some industrial purpose, which is precisely where they had been headed when Nell Voss had stopped at a fence in Omaha on a muddy March morning in 1879 and looked through the gaps at what was stacked in a bankrupt shipyard's yard. They made the round trip in 75 years, from scrap metal to shelter and back to scrap metal. But in between, they kept a family alive. Photographs exist from the early years of the 20th century, black and white images taken in the flat, deliberate light that the photography of that era required, showing a structure sitting against the flat Dakota horizon that does not belong in any category of building from that time or that place. Low walls, massive arched roof, iron, dark with decades of weather, the whole thing occupying its corner of the prairie with the unmistakable presence of something that was built to work and worked. Looking like nothing else built in that time in that place, because it was nothing else. It was one woman's refusal to accept what everyone around her had decided was impossible. It was $11 spent on scrap iron by a 64-year-old widow who had watched the cold take the person she loved most in the world and had decided with the clarity that comes to people who have run out of things to lose, except the things that matter most, that it was not going to take anyone else. It was 47 trips with a stone-laden wagon to a creek 2 miles away. It was 6 weeks of packed insulation pressed into a 6-inch gap with bare hands. It was an 80-pound iron plate swinging on a fraying rope above a man's head, and the woman on the ladder who kept going after it fell. It was a composition book shared between a child's arithmetic and a 64-year-old woman's temperature records, the numbers accumulating morning by morning through October and November into the December that would prove everything or prove nothing. It was Rudy Becker walking 200 yards through 49 below zero in the dark, carrying his daughter toward a light and that had been placed in a window for exactly that reason, whether anyone had said so or not. It was the door opening. It was the warmth inside. On the coldest night in the memory of everyone who lived through it, when 4 people died and dozens more lost parts of themselves to the cold, and the sound of splitting trees carried across the flat prairie like distant gunfire in the darkness. Nell Voss sat by a modest fire in an iron-arched cabin that she had built with her own hands, and the temperature inside never dropped below 46 degrees, and the children slept without coughing, and the arch held. It held through that night, and through the next, and through the one after that. It held through 8 more winters after the one that proved it, and through the winter of 1887, and through every winter that came after until 1954, when human hands finally took it down and sent its iron back to the furnace from which it had come. Sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the only thing that saves you. Sometimes it holds for 75 years.